Hi, today on the workbench we have a NuTone Model 2071, which is a mid-60s stereo music intercom master station. And it was sent in by a fella from Pennsylvania, and it had sort of the normal amount of age-related problems that these kind of sets have. This particular unit was made in 1966. He reported that recently it developed a big giant buzzing sound on all the speakers, and he also was pretty sure that one of the two channels, A and B, stopped working a long time ago. So he sent it in to me, and oddly enough, he actually has two of these. He has one of these, this one from his home, and he has another one of these in his business also. So that's kind of interesting. This is not so much of a repair video, and it's not really an overview video. I've already done that on the 2071. 2071s are a fairly rare model. You don't see a whole lot of them. They were a lot more expensive than other models from the same period. So in a really good year, we might do 6 or 8, and that's about it, because you just don't see that many of them. So what I wanted to show in this video is some of the challenges that working on a set like this has, because it's not the easiest model in the world to work on. This is how it was sent in to me. This is how I prefer people send them in. It's basically the chassis assembly, the faceplate, the wooden box, and the faceplate and all the knobs. They stay at the customer's house because they don't really need to come here. So this is what came in. He disconnected all of the speakers from the terminal block, which is up here, which I'll show you. It's not too terribly difficult to do, and it makes it a lot better to send it in with the terminal block and the switchboard assembly in place, because then I can clean the switches, and that's always a good thing because at this point they really will need it. Let me go ahead and give you a quick look at what we're looking at here. Front of the unit, AM and FM tuning scales here. AM on the top, FM on the bottom. We have two dial lamps here, and then we have our input selector switch. This is a 2-shaft switch, so you have an inner and an outer, and when you put the knobs on it, you have to turn each knob individually to whichever input selection you want. It doesn't do it automatically. They're not ganged together. We have a balance control, a tone control, the on-off switch volume control, and then we have our AFC tuning lock-in button and our stereo separation control when you're searching for stereo FM stations. This is sort of obsolete in today's world. It doesn't really work the way it was intended anymore, because FM broadcast stereo is a lot different in 2019 than it was in 1966. So this we don't worry about too much. The automatic frequency control works pretty well, but it's a really early version of that type of design. So it's a little, but it's okay for 1966. If we turn it around on the back, you can see we have one large circuit board here. When this is installed, it has a cardboard cover that goes over that'll get installed at the very end. This unit, actually, the repair has been completed, so this helps protect it so you don't short anything out when you slide it into the wall housing. Here we have the top of the terminal block assembly, and there are 5 screws in each column. This has a maximum number of 8 pairs of stereo speakers, so it can be a quite large system. They're actually color-coded here on the label that you can see. You have white, which is channel A output, black, which is common, orange, which is input for the A channel, green, common for the B channel, and yellow output for the B channel. The 2071 is a 5-wire intercom system. 5-wire. It's the only 5-wire system that NuTone ever made, and the reason it's 5-wire is because essentially it's a 3-wire intercom system with 2 more wires for the B channel, for the stereo. So it's a common ground stereo system. A lot of stereo systems, you'll have 2 wires for right channel and 2 different wires for the left channel, for a total of 4 wires. So this is a common ground model. You have 1 wire, which is the common ground, and then you have a 2nd wire, which is the right channel, and a 3rd wire, which is the left channel. So it's kind of unusual that way. It uses standard 3-wire intercom type remote stations. So what kind of problems do these have? Well, these have all the normal age-related problems. And you can see here, we have a sack of parts. And some of these I'm going to take out and put aside for a second. And the rest of them I'm going to show you. So primarily what goes bad in these are, you got a whole bunch of capacitors that fail. And it's kind of interesting because you can tell the history of a unit sometimes by the parts that have been changed out in it. For instance, this big orange one right here, this big Sprague atom capacitor, this is not original from 1966. This was made sometime in the 30th week of 1980. So this unit's been worked on before. I would say most likely it was worked on sometime in the end of 1980 or sometime mid part of 1981. This was a replacement part. All of these other ones here are all original. And oddly enough, all the silver ones are Sprague capacitors because that was a really popular US brand back in the day. And these are all your standard aluminum electrolytic type capacitors. But we also have a small assortment of these. These are old school epoxy capacitors. These are basically terrible types capacitors, and they tend to fail fairly regularly, especially after 53 years. So most of these are failing or have failed, and that contributes to the overall poor sound quality of the unit. The giant buzzing sound was caused mostly by the two big, put those down, the two big power supply capacitors that are down in here. And when I say down in here, that's really what I mean, is down in here. Now I'll show you the tricky part about working on this. A 2071 is perhaps one of the most inconvenient models that there is to work on. And I'll show you why that is. One of the good parts about the design is the room control switches and terminal block assembly actually comes out of the chassis. And if you take the screws out, there would be 4 screws if this was fully reassembled. There are 2 here on the top and 2 here on the bottom. And then off the back of it, there's this cable assembly, and it right here, and it plugs into this multi-pin socket right here. So if you unplug the socket like this, you can tip the switch block assembly out of the chassis. It's easier to do it if it's sitting down, and this comes out. Now they did it this way to make it easier for service, because if you had all of these populated, you had wires on all of these, you would have 50 wires here. Now they're all color coded and they're all in cables, so they're all grouped together properly. If you were just taking this out for some routine type of service, you could take this out and leave it at the customer's house, and that makes your job a little bit easier. The disadvantage to that, if you're going to send it in for repair, is I can't clean the switches then, and then that's on you. Once you get that out, you can see better down inside the set. There is this assembly right here. This is where the multi-pin plug from the terminal block assembly was plugged in, and this is the power connection socket right here. Now 2071s use the same type of transformer that's used in an N2561, N2562, and it's a 20 volt center tap transformer, which means that there are 3 power connections. If you measure from center to right, you have 10 volts. If you measure center to left, you have 10 volts. And if you measure from right outside to left outside, you have 20 volts. So it's an unusual transformer, not made anymore, not have been made for a really long time. So you have to be careful around it because you don't want to burn up the transformer. The biggest pain with working on one of these is the access to the inside is very poor. All of the components that you need to replace are on this board in the back of the set. Now you might be thinking, well, that looks pretty spacious in there. You've got all this room and I can fit my hand in there, and I do have big hands, but if you reach down in there and put your hand in there, you can see you're taking up easily 1/3 of the visible space that you have. Even if we take this assembly out, which is just held in place with 1 screw, one of the nice things about this design is everything is held together with these little self-tapping screws with 1/4-inch heads. So if you have a 1/4-inch nut driver, that makes your life easier. So we can lift this out of the way, and that helps a little bit. You can see a little more of it, but a lot of the components you need to change, they're all buried way down inside in here, and they're all sitting flat on the boards, and you have all kinds of other things in the way, which you have to be really careful of, because replacement parts for proprietary parts are non-existent. So unless you have a spare one to rob something out of, if you break it, you're going to have a problem. It can be very challenging. The other problem with this is you're thinking, well, I can disassemble it and open it up and make it easier. The problem with that is, and yes, you can open it up. You can take out the screws here on the ends. There's 2 here and 2 on the other side. And then there are 2 screws that go through the front of the chassis into the side brackets. So you can take the side brackets off, and that gets those out of the way. There are these metal rails that are screwed to the end caps that the back circuit board is attached to, so you can take those out and do all of that. But unlike, say, a model 2500, which you can unscrew all 4 sides of it and then it kind of folds open like this and you can lay it out and work on it, all of the interconnect wires, all of the wires, get this out of the way, all of the wires that come from all of the switches down in here. Here's our input selector switch. Here's our gain control. Here's our balance control. Over here we have our tone control and our volume control. They're all down here in the bottom, and they all have wires that come off of different points on each of the switches, and then they go across and they're soldered into their appropriate spots on the circuit board. They don't have plug-in connectors like the 2500 does. They don't even have plug-in connectors like a 2058 does. They all are individually wired, and there are probably 30 or 40 individual wires, and it would be totally impractical to try to desolder them all, label them all, make a list as to where they all go. It's just way too much to do, and it's way too invasive. So when you do finally get it partially disassembled, you can fold it open a little bit, but it's not like you can lie the circuit board down flat and then flip it back and forth and work on it. You're still working around all kinds of stuff that's down inside of it. So it's a real pain in the neck to work on, is what it really comes down to. And I think you can probably see mostly in this shot, I'm going to sort of point out where all the parts are that I replaced. So all of these little blue ones that you see scattered around, those are all brand new. There are some silver ones too. Those are actually brand new Sprague capacitors, because Sprague's still in business and you can still buy them. So they're all scattered. There's a whole bunch down in here, and then there's here, and there's a whole bunch down in here, and over here, and way down in here, and this one, and these over in here. So they're all scattered throughout the set. And it's a lot of back and forth and around to get them all replaced. And of course, when you do that, you need to form them properly. You need to have a capacitor sizer, and then you figure out what size the original one is that you took out. You measure the leads, and then you bend the leads on the new one so you have nice right angle bends and it looks all nice and pretty, because workmanship counts. So as for the problems that were reported, the big giant hum, well, the big giant hum had a lot to do with this one right here. This is a 2-section can capacitor. One of the 2 capacitors inside of it, this is the jelly roll type capacitor that I've shown in other videos. It's supposed to have 2 500 microfarad capacitors at, I think it's 35 volts. One of them was marginally probably not too bad. The other one totally dead short. Instead of the second one being a capacitor anymore, it had turned itself into a really big giant resistor, and that's bad. So what did we do with this? Well, I do what I do with all of these, is removed this can, I cut it open, I ripped all the guts out of it, and then I went ahead and restuffed it with 2 modern capacitors of the correct values and voltage, and sealed it back up and put it back in place, and that'll last for a long time. The other one, there was another one that was similar to it that's supposed to be right here where this little blue guy is, and that one looked like this. This is a single section capacitor. This is a 2500 microfarad at 15 volts, and this would have normally been mounted down in there like that, but someone took this out at some point, probably 1981, and put this in its place instead. And this was done kind of old school way, where it sat on the board like this, and they bent the negative lead over and put some heat shrink tubing on it and then plopped it on the board like this. And while that's not horrible, it does tend to kind of want to flop around in there, because the only thing that's holding it in is the little wire leads. So, and I'm not a big fan of that. If it had had the original capacitor, this one, in there, I would have done the same thing as I did with the little one. I would have cut it open, taken the guts out, restuffed it with a modern capacitor, sealed it back up, and put it back in place, mostly for originality. But since it was missing, and this one belongs to me, and it comes out of a set that I own, and I'm not giving this one up for the can, what I did was I searched around and I found what's called a snap-in capacitor. With a snap-in capacitor, instead of having really long wire leads on it that you bend and stick through the holes and so forth, it has these funky little hook assemblies, and they do just what it's described as. When you push them through the holes, they snap into the holes and stay in place, and then you solder it on the other side. Snap-in capacitors are designed to sit on a board like this, so that's good. It's not a problem. It's nice and stable, and this is the same value as this one, although it is a higher voltage because it needed to be large enough to fit into the holes. The higher voltage is not a problem. What it essentially means is this little blue guy right here, it'll last forever. It'll easily go 50 years probably before it ever needs to be replaced. So we've covered 2 of the 3 reported problems. The overall poor sound quality was the general tiredness of the capacitors and the one circuit board in the unit. The loud buzzing sound was caused by failures in the power supply. And then we had the last complaint, which was we had no B channel. B channel was dead. Well, B channel was dead because of these. Since this is a stereo amplifier, it means that it has 2 amplifiers in it. You have a right channel amplifier and a left channel amplifier. And this is an old school design where you have discrete transistors for the outputs of each transistor. This is B channel, this is A channel, and these work in pairs like this. And the transistors in this channel were bad. And I think the reason that they were bad is that they were also replaced in probably 1981, because the original transistors, these 2 are Texas Instrument transistors. These are RCA, and NuTone didn't use RCA transistors in any of their sets, and there's no date codes on these, so I don't know how old they are, but I'm guessing they're 1981. One of these was all out and out bad, and the other one was on its way to being bad. So what did I do? Well, this presents a challenge and an issue because of the age of the unit. Early sets and early electronics and early transistors from the 60s, these are not silicon transistors, these are germanium transistors. They're old school transistors. So you have a choice. You can replace them with original germanium style transistors, or you could replace them with modern silicon transistors. However, if you do that, you have to make modifications to the rest of the set to accommodate the different type of transistors. And the reason you have to do that is because transistors have what's called a bias voltage. And it's the amount of voltage that is required to turn the transistor on initially before it starts to actually work. Germanium transistors, for the most part, the bias voltage is about 0.3 of a volt. Modern silicon transistors require 0.6 of a volt. So if you put modern ones, modern silicon transistors in place of germanium transistors, the problem that gets is there's not enough voltage to turn the transistors on initially before they have to do any kind of work. And then as the voltage goes up, so they can do the work that they're supposed to do, you get what's called crossover distortion. And crossover distortion is not like crossovers in your speakers. Crossover distortion is the distortion you get as the transistor crosses over from being off to being on. And you don't want that because it's hard on the transistors. It also makes it sound really crappy. and we don't want that. The give and take on it is germanium transistors, while still available nowadays, are kind of pricey. You have to balance out the difference between the cost of the parts compared to silicon transistors, which cost less, but then you have extra labor because you have to modify the set. Some sets are easier to modify than others. This one, not so particularly easy to modify. So it's not worth the extra time. Plus, for the sake of originality, I decided that we would put in original germanium transistors. And this pair right here happened to be an original pair of new old stock NuTone transistors for this model and for 256162s, because I have a little bit of a stock of them. The other thing that's important that you have to keep in mind is these two work as a pair. They work together. And you'll notice here on each one, there's a little bit of blue paint. And the blue paint was added to the case when these were manufactured at Texas Instruments, and it's a rating of the general gain characteristics of these two transistors. Back in the old days, and even today to some degree, after transistors are manufactured, they'll be individually tested and sorted by the gain range that they have. Because in this type of design, when you have complementary transistors working together, you want them each to be in the same gain range as each other. You don't want a blue one and a red one, or a red one and a white one. You should never do that, because they'll be out of balance and they won't work properly, and it'll sound weird, and also it can damage the amplifier or damage the transistors. So they should be the same, and that's important. Also, that leads up to the question, what if only one of the two were bad? What if the original one, if this one was the one that was shorted out and this one was still okay, could you just replace the one? Well, you could if you had one that matched its gain correctly, but if you didn't have a matching one, then you should replace them both. Best practice is you always replace them in pairs. Now, just because we replace these two doesn't mean that we automatically have to replace these two over here. These have blue paint on them, so these are in one gain stage. These have red dots on them, so these are in the next gain stage, but they're close enough that it's not going to make any difference, and it's hard to justify due to the cost to replace two perfectly good transistors just to make sure they all have blue paint. Now we have a nicely working model 2071. Yes, it is a pain in the neck to work on, but that's how some models are. The earlier models tend to be more awkward to work on than later models, although the overall quality of the early models is hard to beat. So it's well worth the effort, and I know this fella will appreciate how good it sounds now. So it's just sort of an overview of the type of work you have to do when you repair a set like this. I hope you found this interesting and perhaps helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up on YouTube, because that always helps. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and make sure when you click on the bell, you click on it so you get notifications for all videos, and you can put in your email address and you'll get a notification every time we post a new video. That's all for today. See you on the next video.